As we continue to honor Indigenous Peoples Day this evening, let's also remember that it's National Hispanic Heritage Month. And with that in mind, I want to take a look now at one amazing character from fiction that's inspired by real life legacies of Indigenous and Hispanic brilliance. I'm talking about La Borinqueña. She's an Afro-Latina superhero who draws her powers from the history and mysticism found on the island of Puerto Rico, also known as Borinquen. She's also the face of the best-selling graphic novel series of the same name that tackles issues like race, gender, and climate change. And they do so with courage and beautiful imagination. Here to tell us more is the creative genius behind it all, the renowned graphic novelist, the philanthropist, and the creator of La Borinqueña, Edgardo Miranda-Rodriguez. Welcome to Black News Tonight, sir. Talk to me about La Borinqueña. Who is she?
First of all, man, that is like the dopest intro I've ever heard. The way you said Borinqueña, that was beautiful, bro. Wow, man, I really appreciate that. That was some beautiful passion. So La Borinqueña, like you said, she's an Afro-Latina from Puerto Rico, which also is part of the African diaspora. And she is a character that I created in 2016 as an opportunity to truly engage people in a discourse around decolonization of Puerto Rico by incorporating a narrative with contemporary social, political, economic issues, and even environmental issues affecting Puerto Rico. We were the first book to actually come out as a graphic novel series to address these issues. More importantly, the first Afro-Puerto Rican to actually have her own comic book series. And less than a year later, we were approached by DC Comics to produce an anthology for Puerto Rico. And that was an opportunity that we had to bring this entire universe of DC characters like Wonder Woman, Superman, Batman, and many others to Puerto Rico for the first time in their collective canon in over 80 years. That project, Reconstruction, gave birth to what is now our La Borinqueña Grants Program, which is how we annually award grants to nonprofit organizations, grassroots organizations across the island of Puerto Rico. We felt it was important to create a philanthropic effort that was sustainable. So the organizations that we support reflect the values of our character. Organizations that are devoted to the preservation and celebration of Afro-Puerto Rican heritage, women's health and reproductive rights, youth programs for arts and education, sustainable farming, and environmental justice. And this is our 5th year. As you said before, today is Indigenous Peoples Day. We lovingly refer to our character as an Afro-Taína, a character with African and Taíno roots. And for those who don't know, the Taínos were the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean, from Cuba, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, Barbados, and many other Caribbean islands. And this is why we created this project, to try to connect people to this history and also to affirm our diversity as Latin people. And oftentimes in Latin media, even in mainstream media, there's a very Eurocentric standard of kind of like looking at what Latin people even look like. And we wanted to be the antithesis of that, to truly celebrate and acknowledge the beauty of our heritage by having our protagonist be an Afro-Latina.
You know, it's such an interesting thing, you know, when you spend time on the island, and not just Puerto Rico, but anywhere in the Caribbean, Spanish-speaking Caribbean, you know, you'll see people with visibly African features, but oftentimes the media doesn't represent that. And sometimes when you talk to people, they'll talk about the Spanish side. They may even talk about the Taino side, but they don't want to talk about the African side. And conversely here, I mean, you're in New York. You're near the Schomburg Center, right? And people will talk about Arthur Schomburg, but they don't talk about the fact that Arturo Schomburg is from Puerto Rico.
And not only is he from Puerto Rico, he's from Santurce, which is my family's hometown. And Santurce is a neighborhood in the island's capital of San Juan, but it was also a town that actually was populated by the island's first liberated people of African descent. And it's important to acknowledge the presence of Afro-Puerto Ricans. And it's particularly Arturo Schomburg, because for those who have never been to the Schomburg Center in Harlem, I always invite people to do so, especially if you have a family, come to their space for Martin Luther King Jr. Holiday weekend, because they're actually going to be hosting the 10th annual Black Comic Book Festival, an event that I've been supporting and have been a part of for many years now. But as you said, Arturo is actually a Puerto Rican of African descent and was the first scholar to actually use the term Afro-Puerto Rican to affirm his African heritage, but at the same time still acknowledge that he was Puerto Rican. But there have been many other Afro-Puerto Ricans that's important to note. They're the Corderos, uh, a family of two sisters and brother who were the founders of public education in Puerto Rico, and they were of African descent. When they bought themselves out of slavery, the wealth that they were able to amass, what little that they had, they actually opened the first public schools in Puerto Rico. And for those who love baseball, you can't forget about the legendary Roberto Clemente, number 21.
Yes, sir.
The Steelers, one of the first persons of African descent to reach a level of professional career in the Major League Baseball League, and was dually a Puerto Rican as well, and a very proud Puerto Rican to that.
Absolutely. He's from Isla Verde, right? It's an interesting.
A lot of people try to claim him from other parts of the island, but yeah, he was there, and he used to play for the team. A lot of people used to try to say he was from San Juan because he used to play for the Cangrejeros, which is the baseball team in Santurce, and that literally stands for the Crabs. It's also the same name of the basketball team in Santurce as well.
It's so many interesting connections here. Another thing I liked about the characters' superpowers were that, and some fans are saying this, right, that the powers seem similar to that of the Orishas of West Africa. And of course, we know there's a lot of connections between West African religions, Ifa and others, and what we see in Santeria, in Cuba, and in Puerto Rico. We see all sorts of interesting connections. Are we reading too deep, or are you trying to weave this stuff together?
I am trying to do that. I'm so glad that you caught that. One of my madrinas, one of my mentors, is a leading scholar in the African diaspora. That's Dr. Marta Moreno Vega, the founder of the El Museo del Barrio, the Caribbean Cultural Center African Diaspora Institute, and a new organization, an artist residency program in Loíza, Puerto Rico, Corredor Afro, which also happens to be one of the nonprofit organizations that we've actually been supporting via our grants program. And Dr. Marta Moreno Vega, who is someone I hold dear to my heart, who has been mentoring me for decades now, spoke to this kind of like spiritual synergy between all faiths, right? That who may be Yemaya to one, may be Atabex to someone, may be La Virgen de Guadalupe to another. It's all connected, according to what Dr. Marta Moreno Vega says. Even in my second issue of La Borinqueña, there's a scene, and it's also important to acknowledge that today is also National Coming Out Day. In the second issue of La Borinqueña, there is a scene, an unfortunate homophobic hate crime that's about to happen, and La Borinqueña steps in to thwart that, right? But the young men that she actually saves automatically refer to her as Yemaya, because she literally peers out of the water, and she is kind of like this ethereal, spiritual, almost like water deity. But she affirms them, and she says, no, I'm not Yemaya. I'm just like you. I'm Puerto Rican. Yo soy Puerto Riqueña. And I think that's one of the things that I try to do, not only through the story, but through our activism and philanthropy, is to validate and affirm the work of real heroes that are on the ground, that don't have capes, and to also remind one another that we are there for each other, you know. And then when we're in Puerto Rico and we work with Afro-Puerto Rican communities, or we work with communities that dedicated to, or rather organizations dedicated to environmental justice, it's this beautiful synergy, but also celebration of the diversity that we have. And you're right, you're right. Oftentimes here in the U.S. and even in Puerto Rico, it isn't spoken about, our blackness. And unfortunately, there is a lot of colorism. We're not going to have this conversation and pretend that there isn't colorism. There is. It's embedded, unfortunately, even into our lexicon. In the black community here in the U.S., there is obviously the concept and the language of saying good hair, bad hair. Well, that's literally the same in Spanish as well. Pelo bueno, pelo malo. And phrases like, that pretty much would translate to get out from the sun, because if you stay out there too long, you're going to darken. So there's a lot of unfortunate
Exactly.
colorism.
We have a lot of
and
unlearning to
bigotry in
do.
our youth.
No, exactly. We have colorism, we have other forms of racism, and we have a lot of unlearning to do. But one of the places that happens is the classroom. One of the places that happens is in our homes. But another place that this happens is through art. And the art that you're creating, the art that you've created in this wonderful city, La Borinqueña, is going to get us exactly where we need to be, which is moving forward and acknowledging our roots, our history, and where we have to go moving forward. Edgardo, thank you so much for joining me. Thank you so much for your brilliant insight.